What if the deepest mystery in modern science is not out in the stars, but moving quietly behind our own eyes? For generations, we were taught to picture consciousness as a byproduct, a brief electrical shimmer rising from the chemistry of the brain and fading when the machinery goes still. It was a neat explanation, practical, comforting even, and yet some questions have never stayed neatly contained. Across hospital rooms, laboratories, meditation halls, and silent fields of data, a different pattern has begun to appear. Not a final answer, not a grand declaration, more like a change in weather, a subtle pressure building at the edges of what we thought we knew. Researchers studying memory, perception, healing, and awareness have found themselves returning to the same unsettling possibility, that consciousness may be less like smoke from a fire and more like a landscape we have only just entered. This story begins there in that uncertain light between certainty and wonder. It moves through moments of clinical death and unexpected recall, through quantum experiments and biological puzzles, through plants that seem to remember, minds that seem to influence bodies and systems, human and perhaps not entirely human, that blur the line between mechanism and experience. Some of these findings are contested, some are preliminary. Most of them ask more than they answer. That is what makes them worth listening to. Because beneath the technical language and the measured caution of scientific papers lies something ancient and deeply human. We want to know whether awareness is small or vast, whether it is locked inside us or shared in ways we barely understand, whether thought is only a private event or part of a larger fabric we brush against without knowing, and if consciousness is stranger, older, and more fundamental than we imagine. Then the question is no longer just how the brain creates experience. It is whether experience itself has been quietly shaping our idea of reality all along. What remains of a person when the monitors go quiet? In an intensive care unit, time does not move in ordinary ways. It gathers in the blue glow of machines, in the clipped language of nurses, in the stillness that falls when a heart stops and everyone in the room turns toward the same fragile task. For decades, medicine treated that threshold as a closing door. When circulation ends and the brain falls silent, consciousness, we assumed, follows. And yet some of the most unsettling testimony in modern research comes from people who returned from that edge, insisting the door did not close at all. In one major resuscitation study, survivors of cardiac arrest described moments that should have been inaccessible to them. They recalled the rhythm of compressions, the placement of instruments, fragments of conversations spoken while they were considered clinically unresponsive. A few accounts were not vague impressions, but sharply structured memories reported with a clarity that felt, to those who lived them, more vivid than ordinary waking life. This is where the story becomes difficult and therefore important. Skeptics argue that memory can be stitched together after trauma, that the brain under stress may create narratives out of fragments. Researchers, more cautious than believers and more curious than dismissive critics, designed tests to reduce that possibility. Hidden visual targets, details unavailable from the hospital bed, were placed in clinical settings to ask a simple question. If awareness continues, what exactly can it perceive? The results did not end the debate. They deepened it, because if even a small portion of awareness can persist when measurable brain activity has faded, then the old model begins to tremble. Perhaps consciousness is not produced in the same way a light bulb produces light. Perhaps the brain is less an inventor than a receiver, less a factory than a lens. And standing beside that possibility is a quieter human question. If the mind can remain present at the edge of death, then what else about our inner life have we mistaken for something smaller than it truly is? Can attention leave a mark on the world it observes? For centuries, science has tried to protect reality from the instability of human feeling. A stone falls, whether anyone watches it. A cell divides without waiting for belief. The elegance of the scientific method rests in part on that distance. The observer stands back. Nature proceeds. But at the smallest scales, that separation has always been less secure than it seems. In recent years, some researchers have returned to an old and uncomfortable question. What if awareness is not merely witnessing physical processes, but participating in them? Not through magic and not in ways that cancel physics, but through subtle relationships we are only beginning to measure. Studies of quantum behavior in living systems have opened a narrow and controversial doorway into that possibility. Inside neurons, tiny structural components called microtubules have attracted unusual attention. They were once treated as little more than scaffolding, part of the cell's architecture. But some scientists now suspect they may also support exquisitely delicate processes, forms of order that resemble quantum coherence, persisting in the warm turbulence of biological life longer than expected. If that sounds improbable, it is because it is. And yet improbable things often become the beginning of better questions. In experimental settings, trained subjects asked to sustain deep, focused attention appeared to correlate with shifts in the coherence patterns measured in nearby living systems. The stronger the concentration, the more pronounced the effects seemed to be. Meditation experience mattered. Internal calm mattered. The quality of attention itself appeared to matter. None of this settles anything. Correlation is not destiny. Mechanisms remain uncertain. Replication remains the real test. But even as the debate continues, the image it leaves behind is difficult to forget. A human mind, silent and steady, in a living system responding as though observation were not passive after all. Perhaps consciousness is not an isolated lantern sealed inside the skull. Perhaps it is more like a tuning force, faint but real, meeting the world where matter is still fluid enough to listen. And if attention can shape even the smallest edge of reality, then what else have we been touching all our lives without knowing its name? What if memory is not stored the way we have always imagined? Picture an old library after a storm. Shelves remain standing, but the catalog is scattered, pages drift loose, and yet somehow the story survives. Neuroscience has long searched for memory as though it should behave like a filing system. Specific experiences tucked into precise neural locations, waiting to be retrieved. That model has explained much, but not everything. In studies of people who suffered brain injury, degeneration, or surgical disruption, researchers found something both hopeful and disorienting. Certain abilities vanished as expected. Certain names, places, and routines dissolved. Yet in some cases, memory did not disappear in the orderly way the model predicted. Fragments remained where they should not have remained. Complex impressions resurfaced even when the underlying structures seemed too damaged to support them fully. It was as if memory had been bruised, not erased. This has led some scientists to reconsider a radical possibility, that memory may be less like data stored in one place and more like a distributed pattern, dynamic, relational, perhaps even field-like in ways not yet understood. The brain would still matter enormously. Damage it, and access becomes unstable. But access is not always the same thing as existence. A broken radio cannot play a symphony, yet the music has not ceased to be broadcast. Researchers exploring this territory are careful with their language. They do not claim proof of some cosmic archive where every thought is preserved. What they do suggest is subtler and in its own way more profound. That remembrance may arise from interactions spread across the brain and body, and perhaps from processes that are more fluid than current models allow. Memory may be something we participate in, not just something we possess. That idea changes the emotional landscape of forgetting. It means the fading of memory is not merely deletion, but a disturbance in connection, a loosening of the thread. And maybe that is why memory feels so mysterious to us. It is never only about the past. It is about presence, identity, and the fragile miracle by which a human life remains somehow itself across time. Can the body know something before the mind has words for it? In a quiet laboratory, the experiment looks almost simple. A subject sits before a screen. Images will appear, some ordinary, some emotionally charged. Sensors track heartbeat, skin conductance, breath, tiny fluctuations too small for everyday awareness. The conscious mind, for the moment, knows nothing. The image has not yet arrived, and still, in some studies, the body begins to change before the picture appears. This strange interval, a few seconds, sometimes less, has become one of the more intriguing edges in consciousness research. Investigators found that the nervous system occasionally seemed to anticipate emotionally significant events before participants could consciously register them. The effect was subtle, statistical, rather than theatrical, and not every study agreed. But enough signals emerged to keep the question alive. Why would the body prepare for a future stimulus it has not yet encountered? Skeptics offer grounded explanations. Random variation can masquerade as meaning. Experimental design may unintentionally shape outcomes. The brain, always predicting, might be responding to hidden patterns rather than true anticipation. These are serious objections, and any honest account must leave room for them. Science advances not by protecting wonder, but by testing it. Yet even with that caution, something about these findings resonates with lived experience. Many people know the feeling of sensing a phone call before it comes, or feeling a room shift before anyone speaks. Most such moments are easily dismissed. Memory selects the hits and forgets the misses. And still, the possibility lingers that consciousness may not move through time as neatly as we assume. Perhaps awareness is not a spotlight sweeping across one instant after another. Perhaps, under certain conditions, it behaves more like weather, forming patterns ahead of perception, touching us before we understand what we are feeling. The body may be listening for more than immediate survival. It may be tuned to a world richer in signal than ordinary attention can decode. If that is true, even in small ways, then intuition is not the opposite of reason. It may be reason's older relative, quieter, less articulate, but no less shaped by reality. What if healing begins not only in the chemistry of medicine, but in the meaning carried by the mind? A patient takes a pill believing relief is on the way. Sometimes the pill contains an active drug, sometimes it does not. And yet the body can respond in both cases. Pain eases, breathing softens, tremors diminish. Even measurable biological markers can shift. For generations, this was treated almost as an inconvenience in clinical trials, something to control for and subtract. But the so-called placebo effect is not an illusion. It is a record of the mind altering the body in plain sight. Researchers now understand that expectation can trigger real cascades in the brain and nervous system. Neurochemicals linked to reward, pain control, and stress regulation are released not simply because a molecule arrives, but because a person anticipates change. The meaning attached to treatment, the voice of the doctor, the ritual of care, the trust placed in the process, becomes part of the physiology. Hope is not magic. It is a biological event. That realization has widened the conversation. If belief can help the body move toward repair, then consciousness is doing more than observing illness from behind the eyes. It is participating in recovery, shaping internal conditions, influencing how pain is interpreted, how immune responses are modulated, how resilience is gathered under pressure. The border between mind and body begins to look less like a wall and more like a conversation. Of course, this insight has limits. Belief is not a cure for every disease. No ethical person should use it to deny medicine or to blame the suffering for not thinking correctly. The lesson is not that consciousness replaces treatment. It is that treatment has always included consciousness, whether science knew how to measure it or not. There is something deeply human in that. We do not heal as machines receiving repairs. We heal as meaning-making beings, influenced by story, trust, relationship, and expectation. And perhaps that is why care matters so much. A hand on a shoulder, a calm voice in a difficult room, a promise that recovery is still possible. These are not extras. They may be among the oldest medicines we have ever known. Could awareness exist where we never thought to look for it? A forest does not speak in words, yet it is never silent. Roots trade nutrients in darkness. Leaves turn toward light with a patience older than language. Vines search, pause, adjust. For a long time, we described these motions as automatic, mechanical, almost decorative in the grand hierarchy of life. Plants were alive, certainly, but not sentient in any meaningful sense. They reacted, they did not experience. That confidence has started to soften. Botanists and biologists studying plant behavior have found patterns that feel difficult to dismiss as mere reflex. Some plants appear to distinguish between kinds of touch, responding differently to threat, to harmless contact, even to repeated stimuli that prove non-dangerous. Others show signs of remembering environmental conditions and altering future behavior accordingly. Roots navigate soil in ways that suggest flexible problem-solving. Networks underground distribute resources with a selectivity that hints at something more complex than blind chemistry. No serious researcher claims that a tree is thinking like a human being, or that a flower contemplates its own existence. The danger here is projection. We are always tempted to place our own face onto the natural world. But the opposite danger is just as real. To define consciousness so narrowly that anything unlike us is excluded before it can be understood. Perhaps awareness is not a single achievement reached only by brains like ours. Perhaps it exists on a spectrum, appearing wherever life develops the ability to sense, adapt, remember, and respond in integrated ways. If so, then consciousness may not have arrived suddenly in the human story. It may have been whispering through life from the beginning, in forms subtle enough for us to overlook. This changes the emotional texture of the world. The garden becomes less like a backdrop and more like a community of presences moving at another speed. Intelligence, then, is not only quickness or speech, it may also be patience, relation, and silent adjustment to a changing world. And if life has been carrying dim forms of awareness long before we named it, then perhaps consciousness is not the rare exception in nature. Perhaps it is one of nature's oldest habits. What happens when minds appear to meet beyond the limits of ordinary distance? It often begins in private, almost embarrassing ways. A mother wakes with a sharp certainty that her child is in danger. A lifelong friend reaches for the phone at the exact moment another is grieving hundreds of miles away. Twins describe parallel moods, shared dreams, strange bursts of knowing that feel intimate and impossible at once. Most of these stories remain where they begin, in kitchens, hospital hallways, family lore, because they are too personal for proof and too meaningful to forget. Science, when it turns towards such claims, does so with caution. For obvious reasons. Human beings are pattern-making creatures. We connect dots too quickly. We remember the remarkable coincidence and ignore the hundred ordinary silences around it. Yet some researchers have tried to test whether emotional bonds might produce effects that are more than anecdote. In controlled settings, separated participants with close relationships have sometimes shown unexpected synchrony in physiological or neural responses, as though one person's internal state faintly echoed in the other. These experiments remain controversial. The signals are small, replication is difficult. Conventional explanations, chance, hidden cues, statistical noise, still stand close at hand. And yet the persistence of the question reveals something important. We do not experience consciousness as sealed and solitary. We experience it as relational. A glance can calm us. A voice can alter our heartbeat. Grief passes through families like weather. Love changes the body long before it becomes a philosophy. Perhaps what we call connection is not merely emotional poetry layered onto biology. Perhaps relation itself is part of how consciousness works. The self may be less like a fortress and more like a shoreline, shaped continuously by contact with others. Under unusual conditions, that contact may travel farther or register more subtly than our current models allow. This does not require mystical certainty, only humility. It may be that minds do not merge, but resonate, not perfectly, not predictably. Just enough to suggest that human awareness was never meant to be understood in isolation. And if consciousness is, even partly, a shared event, then perhaps the deepest truth about being human is not that we think alone, but that we are formed in one another's presence. Can a machine appear conscious without ever truly waking up? In a dim server room, nothing about the hardware suggests inner life. There is only heat, current, pattern, repetition. Rows of processors execute instructions at immense speed, transforming language into answers, images into descriptions, data into prediction. To many people, this is where the conversation about consciousness becomes most unsettling. Not because machines are alive, but because they can sometimes imitate the surface of awareness with astonishing grace. As artificial systems grow more sophisticated, they challenge one of humanity's oldest comforts, the belief that thought is easy to recognize. A machine can now converse, summarize, compose, even mirror empathy in ways that feel uncannily personal. It can speak of fear without feeling it, describe memory without possessing a childhood, and simulate reflection without ever falling silent in the way a human mind does when facing sorrow or awe. The performance can be persuasive. That is precisely why the distinction matters. Some researchers argue that if consciousness arises from sufficiently complex information processing, then advanced machines may one day cross a threshold we do not yet know how to define. Others insist that no amount of outward fluency proves inward experience. A thermostat responds to conditions. A language model responds to prompts. Between response and awareness lies the central mystery. Is there something it is like to be the system itself? For now, no consensus exists. We can measure behavior, adaptation, and complexity. We cannot directly measure subjectivity. That limit is not only a problem for artificial intelligence, it has always been the problem at the heart of consciousness itself. We infer other minds from expression, relationship, and resemblance. We trust that behind another pair of eyes, experience is present. With machines, resemblance may no longer be enough. And perhaps this is the real gift of the question. In trying to decide whether an artificial system could ever be conscious, we are forced to ask what consciousness means in us. Is it language, self-modeling, emotion, embodiment, mortality? The ache of time passing? The machine, silent behind its eloquence, reflects the question back to us. And in that reflection, human awareness becomes strange again, less definable, but more precious. What if the universe is not simply made of matter, but of experience arranged in different forms? This idea, once dismissed as philosophical fog, has returned with surprising seriousness in some corners of modern thought. It is known in broad terms as panpsychism, the proposal that consciousness is not an accidental late arrival in cosmic history, but a basic feature of reality itself. Not human consciousness, not thought as we know it, but the faintest interior aspect present wherever existence takes shape. At first, the concept sounds extravagant. We are used to imagining a dead universe that slowly produced islands of feeling through the rare complexity of brains. Panpsychism turns that picture inside out. It suggests that matter was never entirely mute to begin with. The mind did not suddenly appear from nowhere. It emerged from ingredients that already contained, in some primitive and almost unimaginable way, the seeds of subjectivity. Why has this idea resurfaced now? In part because the old problem remains unsolved. Neuroscience can map correlates of experience with breathtaking detail, but correlation is not explanation. We can see which brain states accompany pain, color, memory, or self-awareness. We still do not know why physical processes should feel like anything from the inside. How does chemistry become a first-person world? How do electrical patterns become sorrow, music, or the color blue? For some philosophers and scientists, panpsychism does not solve the mystery, but it changes its location. Instead of asking how experience emerges from absolute non-experience, it asks how simple forms of interiority combine into the rich consciousness we know. That question has its own difficulties. How do tiny sparks become a unified flame? No one can yet say. Still, there is a quiet beauty in the possibility. It invites us to picture reality not as a machine that accidentally learned to feel, but as a continuum in which feeling, however faint, was always somehow present. And if that is even partly true, then consciousness is not an exception in the cosmos. It is a thread running through it, waiting for certain forms, like ours, to become aware of the fabric they were woven from. Why do the most important discoveries so often begin as inconveniences to the story we prefer? By this point, the pattern is impossible to miss. Again and again, researchers approach consciousness from different directions: medicine, biology, physics, psychology, philosophy, and encounter the same resistance. Not only from institutions or skeptics, though those are part of the landscape, the deeper resistance comes from the human need for clean boundaries. We want mind on one side, matter on the other, life here, mechanism there. Subjective experience safely contained within the skull. The world feels easier to manage when its categories stay still. But reality has a habit of ignoring the lines we draw for it. A patient recalls events from the brink of death. A body reacts before a stimulus arrives. Memory behaves less like storage and more like relationship. Healing responds to expectation. Plants show traces of sensing and adaptation that complicate old assumptions. Emotional bonds appear to register across distance in ways that remain difficult to explain. None of these findings prove a grand theory, yet together they create pressure, like water finding cracks in stone. This is often how understanding changes, not with one dramatic overthrow, but with a slow accumulation of anomalies, facts that do not quite fit, questions that refuse to disappear. The history of science is full of such moments, and they are rarely comfortable. New knowledge does not arrive as certainty, it arrives as tension. That tension matters because consciousness is not a side issue in human life. It is the medium through which every life is lived. Every love, every fear, every memory, every piece of evidence passes through awareness before it becomes meaning. To study consciousness, then, is not merely to study the brain. It is to study the condition under which a world becomes a world for anyone at all. And maybe that is why the mystery persists. We are using consciousness to investigate consciousness, like a candle trying to illuminate its own flame. Yet the difficulty does not make the search meaningless. It makes it intimate. The unknown is not somewhere far away. It is the very thing by which we are able to wonder about anything in the first place. What if the real discovery is not that consciousness explains everything, but that it changes how we understand everything else? By now, the temptation is obvious. To gather all these anomalies, all these suggestive findings, and shape them into a single grand conclusion. To say we have reached the answer at last, but the wiser response is slower. The deeper lesson of consciousness research may be not certainty, but proportion. It teaches us how much remains unfinished in our picture of reality and how careful we must be when speaking about what is ultimately fundamental. Science is often described as the conquest of mystery. In truth, it is something gentler and more disciplined. It is a method for living honestly with mystery, reducing illusion where we can, and learning which questions deserve to remain open. Consciousness belongs to that rare category of problems that becomes more profound the closer we look. Every discovery sharpens the edges of what we do not know. And yet, this uncertainty is not a failure. It may be the beginning of a more mature understanding of the human place in nature. For centuries, we imagined ourselves as detached observers standing outside the world, measuring it from a distance. Consciousness unveils that image. It reminds us that the observer is never entirely outside the frame. Experience is not a decorative layer painted onto reality after the fact. It is part of the encounter through which reality becomes meaningful at all. This insight carries practical consequences. It affects how we think about medicine, relationships, education, ecology, and technology. It invites more humility in how we treat other forms of life, more care in how we design systems that influence minds, more seriousness about attention, expectation, and the social conditions that shape inner experience. If consciousness is central, then what we notice, nurture, and ignore becomes ethically significant in new ways. Perhaps that is the quiet revolution unfolding beneath the research. Not a collapse into mysticism and not a retreat from evidence, but a wider image of existence in which mind is not an accidental afterthought. And if consciousness truly matters at the level these discoveries suggest, then the future of knowledge may depend less on dominating the world than on learning. What I mean by learning? At last, how to listen to it. What do we become when certainty gives way to wonder? Imagine the night sky before electricity, when darkness still belonged to the stars. A person stands in a field, looking upward, knowing almost nothing by modern standards, and yet sensing something immense and intimate at once. That feeling, the mix of humility, fear, and belonging, may be closer to wisdom than we often admit. Because after all our instruments, all our models, all our efforts to reduce awareness to equations alone, we find ourselves circling back to a truth both simple and difficult. Consciousness is not merely a topic within life. It is the place from which life is known. This does not mean every mystery conceals a miracle, or that every unanswered question should be filled with metaphysics. Restraint still matters. Evidence still matters. The discipline to say we do not yet know is one of science's great moral achievements. But there is another discipline, equally important, the willingness to let reality be larger than the theories we built to contain it. That willingness changes the tone of the conversation. It softens the old argument between material certainty and spiritual longing. Maybe the future will not belong entirely to one side or the other. Maybe it will belong to a language we are only beginning to learn, one that honors data without flattening mystery, one that studies consciousness without stripping it of lived meaning. Such a language would not ask us to abandon rigor. It would ask us to pair rigor with reverence. And perhaps that is the chapter we are entering now, a time when intelligence is no longer measured only by control, but by depth of attention. When knowledge is not just the power to explain, but the courage to remain awake to what exceeds explanation. In that sense, consciousness may be less a problem to solve than a relationship to deepen. So the question is no longer whether reality contains mystery. It always has. The question is whether we can face that mystery without shrinking it and without shrinking ourselves. Because in the end, what we call consciousness may be the oldest invitation of all, not to possess the world, but to meet it fully while we still can. In the end, the story does not resolve into a single verdict. It opens outward. We began with a question that seemed scientific on the surface and personal underneath. What is consciousness, and where does it belong in the structure of reality? Along the way, the answers refused to stay simple. Near-death accounts challenge the assumption that awareness disappears the moment the brain falls quiet. Studies of attention, expectation, and healing suggested that mind is not merely watching the body from a distance, but participating in its condition. Memory behaved less like a vault than a living network. Plants complicated our picture of intelligence. Human connection blurred the edges of the isolated self. Artificial systems forced us to define what inner life truly means. And philosophy, instead of closing the matter, returned us to the oldest possibility of all, that consciousness may be woven more deeply into existence than modern thought once allowed. None of this gives us permission to become careless. The unknown is not a blank check for fantasy. Every extraordinary claim still deserves extraordinary patience, criticism, and evidence. Some of these findings may fade under stronger testing. Others may survive and reshape entire fields. That is the honest rhythm of inquiry. Discovery is not a straight road. It is a long conversation between doubt and wonder. But perhaps the most important change has already happened. Consciousness is no longer easy to dismiss as a mere side effect, a flicker produced by matter and nothing more. It has become, once again, a serious frontier. Not because we have solved it, but because it keeps reappearing wherever our explanations become too narrow. It waits at the edge of medicine, biology, physics, memory, grief, relation, and meaning, asking whether reality is larger than our habits of description. And maybe that is the final insight. To be conscious is not only to think, it is to stand inside mystery while still reaching for truth. To remember that knowledge is never only about control, it is also about presence, about the way a life is felt from within, about how briefly we are here, and how astonishing it is that the universe, through us, has learned to notice itself at all. So the future question is not merely what consciousness is, it is what kind of world becomes visible when we take consciousness seriously. Not as a loophole in science, but as part of the fabric of being human. A world where memory matters because experience matters, where care matters just because inner life is real, where curiosity is not a luxury, but a form of respect. And if consciousness is, in some still unfinished sense, everything, then perhaps the greatest discovery is not out there waiting to be conquered. Perhaps it is here, in the fragile light of awareness itself, asking us to live more carefully, wonder more honestly, and leave behind a future wide enough for both evidence and awe.